Hey, what is going on, you swag lacking lantern? Today, going to be taking a look at some of the top performing lists from Perth Regionals. Not going to be taking a look at all of the top 8 lists, just some of them, the ones that are the most interesting. Some of them are vanilla and stuff we've seen before, like the Lugia list we're not going to take a look at, and then one of the Lost Box lists as well. I believe it was just the same 60 that I ran at OCIC, so we've seen that before, but a couple of them are interesting. Especially as far as some of the Lost Box builds go. There's an Arctura in top 8 as well that I'm going to talk about briefly, just kind of the tech cards that are currently being ran in it, just kind of give you some insight on why you should be potentially running Arctura that way. But the champion list, and yes, there is a list with the Zacian VSTAR in it, but it's not the champion list, and that's where we're going to start here. It is the second place list. We'll be taking a look at that in just a second. But the champion list is also a Lost Box build. Of course, we got the usual suspects in here of the 4 Comfey, 2 Cram, 2 Sableye, the Greninja's here, Manaphy's here, Zigzagoon is in here. You don't see this in every Lost Box build, but you do see it in most, especially alongside the Raikou. And that is kind of the power attacker in this build of Lost Box, is the Raikou with the amazing shot, 122 in active, 122 a bench for a Grass Lightning Metal. And this was piloted by Derek Dow to the first place finish at Perth Regionals. And the only other attacker on the list is that Zamazenta. Zamazenta is super important because it's super important for Lost Box decks to have a Pokemon that can answer Stoutland in the Lugia decks. But besides that, Zamazenta is nice, just a nice attacker to have in general that can just hit really hard. So a 1-hit KO Stoutland, which is great, but also it just hits for 220 damage when your opponent takes a knockout, which you can't really complain with those numbers. But yeah, the main power attacker in the deck is the Raikou. Now, when you look at this list, you're probably looking at it and being like, where's the Rayquaza? And that's kind of what I thought as well, of course. Where is the Rayquaza? Because usually when you see 2 Raikou in a Lost Box list, it's usually paired alongside the Rayquaza. That would kind of take the space of the Zamazenta, which is a heavy-hitting Pokemon that can not only 1-hit KO Stoutland, but pretty much 1-hit KO anything else in the format if it wants to. But it does come at the cost of playing more energy types, and overall is a little bit less consistent at, attacking with Raikou or attacking with Zamazenta than it would be consistently attacking with Rays. But the trade-off is the power level of the Rayquaza, being able to potentially 1-hit KO, once again, anything in the format. So Raikou, although you do lack the Rayquaza, Raikou is actually the best attacker up against Lugia once you've dealt with Dunsparce and Manaphy. As soon as you deal with Dunsparce and Manaphy, the amazing shot from a Raikou, 120 damage, and then 120 damage on the bench. With so many things in the Lugia deck being weak to lightning, puts on a ridiculous amount of pressure. And Lost Box is really unique in the fact that pretty much any damage you put in play can be utilized either immediately to clean up knockouts or to set up for future knockouts. So sometimes you play these decks that have like snipe damage or hit something really hard, but then the damage is kind of wasted. But when you have attackers like the Raikou, like the Sableye, and even like the Zigzagoon ping to combo with it, you can almost always set up for big attacks or clean up after a big attack super efficiently to always kind of have a very clean prize trade. The rest of the build, the rest of the list is super straightforward, super consistent. We got 4 Quick Ball, the 4 Scoop Net, the 4 Battle VIP Pass, of course. 4 Courses Experiment, 2 Raihan, 2 Bossasaurs. The 2 Bossasaurs was a little bit interesting to me. I'm definitely curious to see how that kind of fits, but I'm sure specifically for the Raikou, you want to make sure you're amazing shotting a very important target and then putting 120 damage on. If your opponent just sends up a target that the Raikou doesn't attack very well into, being able to boss up something else around it towards the mid-late game is probably a pretty big deal. Also being able to boss plus use Cram to KO stuff like Manaphy and Dunsparce, that can be a pretty big hindrance to the amount of damage you can output with the amazing shot. I'm sure is also a pretty big combo, the boss plus the Cram. I'm sure Sableye most of the time is the one that's going out of its way to clean up Manaphy's and Dunsparce's, but it doesn't hurt to be able to go, boss plus Cram in the early game. 3 Ordinary Rod, no Energy Recycler. So the trade-off there is still another card to recover energy. Not quite as much energy as Energy Recycler, but you're not playing something like the Rayquaza or like a Kyogre or something in here, so you don't need as much energy recovery, and being able to be more aggressive about recovering your Pokemon, especially when you play 4 Quick Ball, makes sense. Switch cards, nothing special as well. Escape Ropes, switch cards. 1 Air Balloon. The Temple of Sinnoh in the build as well. A lot of Lost Box decks have been running Temple of Sinnoh as of late because Lugia decks have been including the Wash energy that they've been putting on their Manaphy to make it so you can't Sableye the Manaphy. And if you can't Sableye the Manaphy, then you can't use stuff like Kyogre or Raikou or Greninja to snipe bench Pokemon in the matchup. So Temple of Sinnoh's here. If your opponent gets their Manaphy with the Wash energy, you get the Temple of Sinnoh, you Sableye, KO the Manaphy with the Wash. Or in this build specifically, most builds of Lost Box do play 1 boss, but with this build specifically, you got the 2 boss, you can go boss plus Cram to deal with that Manaphy Wash combo. And then for the energy here, highest energy count is the Metal. of course, because getting the double metal on the Zamazenta is the most awkward attacker you have, and it's super important to immediately respond to Stoutland in the Lugia matchup. So heavy on the metal energy because you got to get the attachment plus the Mirage Gate to get a metal plus another energy out of your deck to the Zamazenta to pull off the Retaliate to KO the Stoutland. Super, super important attack to pull off immediately. As soon as the Stoutland attacks, you got to respond with the Zamazenta. And then 3 Lightning, 3 Grass to Psychic. So whenever attacking with Greninja in this build, no capture energy as well, but overall, I don't think you can capture it. The one card in here that I think I would probably add immediately when I look at this list is there's no Heavy Ball, and I love Heavy Ball in Lost Box decks. So the one change I think I personally would make to this list immediately is I'd probably cut an Escape Rope and add in a Heavy Ball. Heavy Ball is just so powerful in Lost Box. There's a ton of one-of Pokemon that you could potentially prize that you'll need, or if you attack with one of them and prize another, like if you attack with Cram, but then you want another Cram and it's prized, Heavy Ball gets there. And overall, when you have like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, you have 14 Pokemon, you're likely to prize a Pokemon. I can't tell you how many times on turn 1 I've needed a second Comfey, I've used Heavy Ball, and I have like Comfey prize, or like even Greninja prize, and then I can go use a Battle VIP Pass to get a second Comfey or something like that. So that's the one change I would make personally to this list. I do like 4 Quick Ball, but I think I would cut an Escape Rope to get a Heavy Ball in there as well, because I feel like it's so powerful in these Lost Box decks. So that's the winning list. Like I said, looks a little weird to not have the Rayquaza alongside the Raikou, but Raikou is definitely the bigger power attacker in specifically the Lugia matchup. And I'd also say probably up against stuff like Vikavolt as well, which is becoming more popular. Raikou is like the better attacker than the Rayquaza, because Rayquaza kind of exhausts itself of its energy, which means if your opponent just attacks again with a Vikavolt and knocks out Rayquaza, well, you don't have like an attacker setup. But Raikou really forces your opponent to break the item lock to actually deal with it, and then you can kind of take over the game from there. So it's like another reason that like Raikou is a little bit better, and having like a more deck that's a little bit more streamlined around the Raikou is gonna make it that much easier to set it up as opposed to like something like the Rayquaza build. So yeah, I really like this build. I think it's really cool. No Kyogre, no Rayquaza, which have been like the main 2 heavy hitters, I feel like, as of late in Lost Box decks. I guess the other way that Lost Box has been being played, if there's no Raikou, or if there's no Rayquaza or no Kyogre, usually there's some kind of Seal Stone package in there to kind of help your prize trade, but no Seal Stone package in here as well. And still seems like a really good deck, and it did take down the whole thing at the end of the day. So definitely really cool build, and definitely excited to try it out. Okay, the second place list is the build with the Zacian VSTAR. So anyone who doesn't know what Zacian VSTAR does, it's got that Break Edge. First attack for Metal Colors for 200 damage, and then isn't affected by weakness, resistance, or by any other effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. So it can get through stuff like Ice Cube or Flying Pikachu. Gives you a nice, clean answer to both of those. And then you have the Sword Star for Metal Colors for 310 damage. You do 30 damage to yourself, but this can be used to like 1-hit KO Goodras or Duraludons or stuff like, actually 1-hit KO on a Goodra, minus 80. Okay, you're not 1-hit KO on a Goodra quite. I guess you like do some Escape Rope shenanigans. You're not quite 1-hit KO on a Goodra, but Break Edge even is really good against Goodra. But Arceus Duraludon against the Duraludon, combo that with like a little bit of damage on Duraludon from like a Sableye or a Cram hit or whatever, then you're going to be getting the effective 2-hit KO on something like a Duraludon with the Sword Star, or you could like 1-hit KO the Arceus in that matchup as well. Either way, going to be really, really strong up against the Arceus Duraludon matchup, that's for sure. Just a nice big heavy hitter, and of course it does evolve from the classic Zacian V with the Intrepid Sword. I don't know if you're using Brave Blade very much, but it's possible. But this Lost Box build, this one feels, I don't know, this one does not feel as clean. You definitely it feels a little bit more high rolly, I guess. Only one-ofs of each of your attackers. 1 Cram, 1 Sableye, 1 Zamazenta, 1 Zacian VSTAR, 1 Kyogre, and 1 Greninja. Greninja is a pretty powerful attacker when you have the water energy in the deck. So only one-ofs. Of course, you do have the Heavy Ball, but I mean, you just get an awkward early Comfey where you're picking between Colress or Cram or Colress or Sableye or anything like that, and all of a sudden you're losing an attacker that can be super important later in the game. I'm not as big of a fan of this list. I think the Zacian VSTAR is super cool, but even with the Zacian VSTAR being super cool, I don't know if that makes up for the kind of like, it just feels like a very high roll build of Lost Box here. Of course, you got your 4 Comfeys, Manaphy, and the Guru. And then for supporters, pretty solid supporter lineup. You got the 4 Colress, 1 Birdkeeper, 1 Raihan, 1 Boss. No complaints there. I'm not a huge fan of Raihan in these Kyogre type builds of Lost Box. I usually feel like when you have the Kyogre in the build, one of your Mirage Gates committed to the Kyogre towards the late game is so much value. I feel like you don't really need the Raihan in the mid game to kind of make up for not running out of energy acceleration towards the late game. Of course, it is a card that's really nice at just helping you set up any kind of combo throughout the throughout a game. So it's the Raihan's not only there for like extra energy acceleration, but it is just there to be like, okay, I drew into the Raihan, and instead of maybe risking it with a Colress or a Birdkeeper or having to dig for one of those supporters because you only played those 5 if you don't play the Raihan, just play the Raihan, get your energy acceleration, get your Mirage Gate, and then your attacker is set up, whatever it might be, a Zamazenta or Sableye or whatever. Or it might just give you that piece to even just like attack with a Sableye for the turn. You don't have to go like the full Mirage Gate route. Echoing and Horn here to kind of enable the Kyogre a little bit more in some matchups, specifically very good up against stuff like the Goodra matchup and the Arctura matchup. Not as strong up against the Lugia matchup because they can usually fill their bench, or there's usually already enough prize cards in play where you don't really need to like fish for some extra prize cards at all. Yeah, nothing really too crazy in the item lineup as well. The 2 Recycler, 2 Rod, of course. 1 Switch, 3 Escape Rope. Interesting that there's no Switch cards. I guess that kind of makes a little bit of sense because if you open with the Zacian V, Switch cards can't move it if it becomes a Zacian VSTAR. But I don't know if that's a good enough reason to not play Switch card, because it would have to be like you'd have to evolve to your Zacian VSTAR, it be in the active, and then the only Switch card you draw into and would want to move it with would be the Switch. And that's when it would be better than a Switch card. So I don't really like the Switch in here. I feel like that should be a Switch card. And I'm generally a fan of 3 Escape Rope, though, in the Kyogre build, because you do want to be pushing your opponent's active pretty aggressively out of the active towards the end game with the Aqua Storm. You're going to be using some of your Switch cards in the early game, even if you don't want to be able to make sure you're using the Flower Selections to be progressing through your deck to actually build up towards the Aqua Storm. So I do actually like the heavier Escape Rope count in the Kyogre build. And then 3 Quick Ball, 1 Capture Energy, and then 12 of the basic energy, 5 Water, 5 Metal, only 2 Psychic. There is only 1 Sableye in this build, so I think that's maybe reasonable to only have the 2 Psychic. Usually I'm a fan of the 3rd Psychic because it helps you enable the Sableye a little bit better. That's not something I actually mentioned in the first place list, only the 2 Psychic Energy, but I think for the attackers you have, it makes sense to have like the 4-3-3-2. And in this build, it probably also makes sense to have the 5-5-2. I could actually see cutting one of the Waters for another Psychic, but yeah, the heavy metal count makes sense when you got the potential for the Zacian. And once again, Zamazenta is your response to the Stoutland, which is a very important card to respond to immediately. So having a heavy metal count, whenever you can, you kind of just want to do that, because then it makes getting that Retaliate off that much easier. But this is the second place list. It has the Zacian VSTAR. But besides that, it feels like a little bit of, I don't know, it just feels like a lot more variants are in this build. As far as like a Lost Box build goes, if like for some reason you could play a Lost Zone deck without Lost Zoning anything, then playing all these one-ofs of attackers wouldn't feel as bad, but you should have a couple awkward flower selecting. It's that much more potential to have awkward flower selectings when you only play one of your attackers. I can't tell you how many times I've Lost Zoned my first Sableye that I've seen when playing a Lost Box deck. It's really high. I've Lost Zoned, especially up against a Lugia matchup, not so much in the mirror match, but up against a Lugia matchup, the amount of times I like flower selecting or Colress and I see a Sableye. Of course, when you play 2 Sableye, the chance of you seeing the Sableye off the Colress or the Comfey is that much higher. But still, if you only play one and then you see it in the early game, it just gets pretty awkward. Same thing with the Cram actually as well. So that feels a little bit awkward. But besides that, I think it's a cool build. Zacian VSTAR now, it day 2'd Bokum Regionals. Did not do too good in day 2. And now we see it top 8ing here in Perth Regionals. Maybe this card has a little bit more potential than it's been given credit so far. Definitely possible. The next thing I was going to mention is just the Arctura deck that made top 8. The only things I want to talk about here is the Choice Belt and the Lost Cities. Just talk about those 2 tech choices. The Choice Belt, pretty good for the mirror match, the Arctura mirror match, because if you get it on your Duraludon VMAX and you hit your opponent's Duraludon VMAX for 250 damage, and then you hit them again for 250 damage, that's 500 damage. So even if they heal with a Hyper Potion, they're still a little short of actually getting out of range of a 3rd attack. And if your opponent doesn't have the Choice Belt and they hit you for 220, you're out there at the 440 mark. You use a Hyper Potion to heal off the first, or 120 of the first 220, then they get up to 320 with a second attack. So Choice Belt, really powerful in the mirror match, really powerful to one-hit KO Dragonite up against some of the Lost Box builds, the Sky Sealstone Lost Box builds that play the Dragonite. Choice Belt's really important for that as well. And then the Lost Cities, strong against Lost Box decks for sure. Definitely not a game complete takeover card in the Lost Box matchup, but if you get unfortunate with a Lost Zone, or if you're able to get like some early boss plus Lost City combos up against Lost Box decks with the Arctura, you can kind of set them completely out of their powerful attackers potentially. Like if a Lost Box deck just like benches their Zamazenta early, that's one of the heaviest hitting Pokemon in this matchup for Lost Box, and you just have boss Lost City in the early game. I mean, they just don't get the potential to use that, and they're just hitting you with Cram for the rest of the game, which Hyper Potion easily takes care of. So Lost City super strong in that matchup. Also really strong against the Reggie matchup. because, you know, just putting pressure on the Regis by lost zoning a couple of them makes it more awkward for them to play out the game through the rest of the game, with the potential of you potentially being able to lost zone, you know, their second Reggie. Now, they do play 4 Paths to the Peak, so it's a little bit harder for you to keep your Lost City in play than up against something like a Lost Box deck, but it definitely gives you quite a bit more pressure in that matchup to potentially take the dub. I still think a matchup's really close, even if the Reggie player, even if you have the Lost Cities, they got the 4 Path to the Peak. It's up against Reggie. It's still really close as to Rowdon, I would say, for sure. Yeah, even with the Lost City, the Reggie matchup is still about 50-50. So I think it was definitely like slightly favored for Reggies without the Lost Cities. But with the Lost City now, if you're playing the Lost Cities in here, that's kind of the reason to play the Lost Cities, and that's kind of the reason to play the Choice Spell. And the last 2 decks I'll take a look at is just a Vika Vault deck. I just want to kind of touch on, and this was played by Jake Lazari, and the second place list was played by Jocko. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your first name. I apologize, Wong. So shout out to them for their placements. And then the Vika Vault list, Vika Vault, Natalie Miller, and Christian Hasbani. There's only one difference in their list. It's a judge instead of, I don't know what the card difference, to be honest. Hasbani played a judge, and Natalie did not play a judge, but I don't know. It looks like a trekking shoes is the only difference. I like the judge personally. I'm actually interested to know why Natalie didn't play the judge. The only thing I really want to comment on here is the Path to the Peak build of Vika Vault versus the Aerodactyl build. I do actually think I favor the Path to the Peak build a little bit more. It feels a little bit more consistent, and its game plans are a little bit more easy to replicate into the Lugia matchup, is what I've kind of found. So I have been favoring the Path to the Peak build a little bit more than the Aerodactyl build. Also, the Path to the Peak is pretty strong in the Lost Box matchup, shutting down the Greninja, taking away their concealed cards for any kind of like continued draw support from that, because that matchup is pretty close, to be honest, especially with more and more builds of Lost Box, including Raihan. That's kind of a card that is tough for Vika Vault to deal with when they go like turn 2, turn 3 Raihan to like set up a big attacker that all of a sudden the Vika Vault player can't really deal with Paralyzing Bolt, and you have to kind of break item lock early, a lot earlier than you'd like. So Path to the Peak kind of slowing them down a little bit, I do like. For sure. So I do favor, that's kind of all I want to talk about. I kind of do favor the Path to the Peak build over the Aerodactyl build, but I don't think it's really too much for me to say besides that. Maybe I'll do like a Vika Vault video in general, kind of breaking down the deck a little bit more, talking about the matchup a little bit more in the future. One unique thing in their list that I haven't seen a lot of actually lately is the Pumpkaboo. I imagine this is mostly for the Mew matchup, so you can make sure you can bump Mew's Path to the Peak out of play to make sure you can use your Drapion on a turn with Sky Sealstone, because otherwise it can be kind of hard to get access to that wild style ability of the Drapion if you don't have a way to bump Path to the Peak, because you do play Path to the Peak yourself. I was personally playing a Vacuum in here over the Pumpkaboo space. The Vacuum you can find off of the Mysterious Tail from the Mew, but Pumpkaboo probably a little bit more consistent. You know, you do have 4 Quick Ball and stuff like that, so it's probably pretty close, because you're going to be burning Quick Balls in the mid game and early game to actually continue playing the game and setting up the game. But your matchup against Mew is pretty fast. Like, you try and take a Genesect knockout with a Raikou, and then Drapion plus Sky Sealstone to close out the game. So potentially you're only playing like 1, maybe 2 Quick Balls throughout the game. So yeah, that's all I really want to say on the Vika Vault build. I like the Path build over the Aerodactyl build. The Aerodactyl build still seems pretty strong. Of course, Alex Szymanski did just get top 8 at Knoxville Regionals with the Aerodactyl build, so it's pretty close. I just kind of slightly favor the Path build because I think it does have a slightly better Lost Box matchup. Taking away their possibility of Greninja, I think, is does quite a bit. Does quite a bit for sure. Okay, that's going to do it for me. This is the top list, some of the top lists from Perth Regionals. The other ones were just Lugias, and then one of them was a Lost Box, the same 60, I believe, that I won OCIC with, so nothing too much to talk about there. Just wanted to talk about the ones that I thought were interesting. We're bringing some new stuff to the table, and I'll catch y'all in the next video. Peace.